Okay, good morning and welcome everyone to our joint event on sex work and mental health. This event was developed in partnership with the European Sex Workers' Rights Alliance, formerly ICRSC, and National Ugly Mugs UK. My name is Raven Bowen and I'm the CEO of National Ugly Mugs, and I'm honored to have been asked to host part of this event. Today we have translation in Spanish by Alejandro, that's my terrible accent, and Russian by Olga, and we hope to have French translation soon. The event is live streamed on Facebook and will be recorded as well. Our agenda today is broken into two parts. So part one is about research and policy, and part two is about community initiatives on mental health. We'll hear in part one from research presentation by PG Macioti and Giulia Garofalo Geymonat, done in partnership with Professor Nick Mai and others. Nick Mai and others who were part of the research will be hosting or responding to questions as part of the Q&A. Then we'll hear a presentation and background document on the toolkit on sex work and mental health from the European Sex Workers' Rights Alliance, done by Jules James. And then we'll have time for questions. So today's event is really important given the state of affairs. We have to make room to learn about and seek to do action on mental health issues among individuals in adult industries. Sorry, I'm looking at my live stream and there's a delay. So who leads knowledge creation and who works on issues about this really matters. So today we'll hear about research, policy, and action, all done with and for and by sex workers. So by way of biography, I'd like to introduce Dr. PG Macioti. She is a social researcher and sex worker rights activist based in Europe and Australia. Her research focuses on sex work, peer education, stigma, mental health, trafficking and migrant labor exploitation, language, citizenship, and migrant self-organizing. PG has previously worked in the UK, Germany, and the US, and also Australia. She's currently researching health and social well-being among sex workers in Victoria, Australia, and this is funded by the Department of Health, and it is done in advance of the decriminalization of sex work in that state. And Giulia is a social researcher and activist in fields of labor, gender, sexuality, and disability, and she works at Ca' Foscari University, is that correct? In Venice, you'll correct my, okay, that's good. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce, please join me in welcoming PG and Giulia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having us and for giving us this opportunity. I wanted also to highlight that we are going to be three presenting. Our team is a big team. So we had several research assistants from the peer community. And today specifically, there is going to be Ophelia, who is going to present with Giulia and I, and who is an activist in queer and sex worker rights. And I'm very, very happy that she will join us. And there is going to be also at least one more that I could see in the audience, one more researcher who joined the research, who is going to be able to answer questions together with Nick. So if you are okay with it, I'll start sharing my screen.
PG, I just interrupt you because Luca might jump in to do the French translation. If there is any participant who needs French translation, can you please say it in the chat, and then we can add Luca as a translator. Otherwise, we will continue just with English, Russian, and Spanish. Go ahead, PG.
So thank you very much again. I am absolutely thrilled to be finally presenting this research, which has been a long time coming and very needed. So first of all, as I said, the research team was a big research team. So we have to also, we must acknowledge it all in its wealth. So we had Iyit Aldinalp for the UK. We had Aura Cadetto in Italy, Ophelia Eglantin, who is here today, Antonia Filipova, who I think is in the audience, and Liat Hussein Kantarovic and Olga Venergren. So about the research, sex work mental health was a research that was based at Hydra e.V., which is a sex worker rights organization and outreach service in Berlin. And it was funded by the OSF, by the Open Society Public Fund. It was a participatory research, which involved peer researchers like myself and research assistants from quite diverse backgrounds, also in terms of migration history and ethnicity, etc. The research assistants conducted 118 in-depth purposive interviews with diverse sex workers. And when I said purposive, meant that we specifically targeted sex workers with self-understood mental health needs. We also conducted 10 in-depth interviews with mental health services and practitioners in all of the 4 settings. So in the research, I should mention again, it is based in Germany, Italy, Sweden, and UK. And we conducted an average of 30 interviews in each place. The aims of our research were to explore sex workers' own understanding of their mental health needs and to understand if and how sex workers do access, and how, if they do access mental health support, how they experience it. Professional mental health support. That's what we've meant here. We also wanted to compare sex workers' experiences of mental health support in countries which have very different legal approaches to sex work. And in doing so, we also wanted to explore which structural barriers are those that are affecting sex workers' experiences of quality mental health support and of access to it. So, and also obviously we wanted to produce policy making and best practice recommendations for governments and practitioners. So in terms of the overall sample, of course, the recruitment strategies and the research assistance positionalities were different in each country. So the demographics vary for each country, and you can see the different demographics in the report, which is already available online. But overall, I will present some aggregated data. We had, in terms of gender diversity, 66% of the sample were cis women. 23% of the sample were trans and non-binary persons, and 11% were cis men. In terms of other demographics, we had 22% white national sex workers, 25% Black and Indigenous people of color, and 53% were migrant. So self-understood migrants. So in terms of age, there was a very, very big variety from between 19 and 79. In terms of sectors, we aimed at covering a lot of sectors. So we had street-based sex workers, indoor brothel workers, private workers, escort, strippers, and porn workers, and phone sex workers as well. In terms of class background, 59% self-understood as working class from more a working class background, 41% from middle class, and 36% had completed higher education. So now talking about the overall key findings before getting into the countries a bit more in depth. First of all, a big finding of our research was that many sex workers talked about how sex work was a very important source of income for them. Again, sex workers with mental health needs, because of them experiencing exclusion due to several factors, mainly also because of their mental health needs from mainstream labor markets. And I've got a few quotes here, and they are quite telling. So, for instance, I'm a trans woman of color with a migrant background. My mental health staff doesn't allow me to seek out office work type jobs, says Andrea. Or lots of people choose sex work because their mental health means they can't work normal jobs. There are lots of disabled sex workers. For me, I have intense depression and it is difficult to motivate myself and do anything different, said Chloe. And I'm happy to share the PowerPoint with everyone in the group. So I'll go ahead as we are a bit pressing time. And now, of course, my is not working. Why? Okay, got it. So another important finding was that most sex workers experience, and this will come as no surprise at all, experience sex work and also intersectional stigma as a main burden that affects their mental health. So many talked about double life, isolation, and discrimination. And this is what was linked to mental health needs more saliently. So, for instance, people think sex work like something dirty and bad. That's not good for the psyche. I don't want to be ashamed because I had this job, said Jasmine. Or, yes, it does allow you to make money, but it makes you feel bad because it's as a bad thing, said Calogero. Or my mental health stuff wasn't perfect when I started sex work, but stigma is the thing that gives me anxiety. And then this quote says it all. It's like, yeah, of course, if there was no stigma at all, I wouldn't need therapy, from Adriana. Of course, all the names are fictional, and they're neither their real names nor the working names of the participants. So another important note is that stigma in terms of the fear of disclosing one's sex work or the potential repercussion of it because of criminalization, etc., is also linked to another structural factor that is strongly linked to mental health, which is sex workers' lack of access to stable housing. So, third finding, sex workers with mental health needs displayed a really large variety of problems, and no particular recurrent one, like in the general population. Most actually saw their mental health problems as preceding engagement with sex work. However, obviously, the context of sex work, especially criminalization, including criminalization of sex work and of migration, context of coercion, individual predisposition, and also obviously bad working conditions were experienced as very harmful to one's mental health, responding to the degree in which they were experienced as bad. So, for instance, Tia says, I'm sure sex work impacts on mental health for those who are not suited or work under bad conditions or don't want to do this job. Or, for instance, says Alice, illegality and the lack of acknowledgement of our work impacts on our mental health, quite frankly. Or Camilla, you are alone if something bad happens to you. I could probably go to the police if I wasn't doing sex work, but in my case, I couldn't. And it does affect my mental health. Or also in the words of Stella, who is a non-documented migrant, Black migrant sex worker in the streets of Italy, you constantly need to be alert and careful. You can never relax, and this makes you feel bad in the long term. So it's pretty clear. Then, for finding some sex workers experience sex work as beneficial to their mental health, whereas all sex workers who felt coerced and wished to leave the industry saw sex work as detrimental to their mental health. So it's a bit of a follow-up from the previous finding, a bit more explicitly explained. So for instance, in the words of Helga, I feel much better since I do sex work. Mental health is tied to finances in many ways. Who can't deny if we don't have how to feed ourselves? Our mental health is also suffering. So for Emilia, instead, sex work is a healing process. With sex work, I can determine myself what I want from my body. Whereas in the words of somebody who experienced in coercion from her situation, from the constraints she was in, Linda, for instance, said, you have to behave as if you were acting in a movie all day, then you get confused, you don't know who you are anymore. You think of what you're doing it for the money, but you don't like it and you'd rather not do it, but you do it because you must eat. And for her, sex work was really linked to bad mental health, but she didn't want to do it. So it's really a clear distinction there in terms of how the working conditions and context of sex work affects rather than sex work itself. So fifth, sex workers displayed really a large array of coping strategies. But the one we're going to mention now, the one that came out the most was peer support and social connections, which were seen really as fundamental. So for instance, in the words of May, I found the support I was looking for through peers and friends. I needed solidarity and insurance that if anything bad happens, there would be people to go to. Or Dani said, peer support is life-saving. When we do jobs that are stigmatized and isolating, we need to find people to share our lives and experiences with. So I think, okay. Am I passing the ball?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me? Oh, yes. Okay. So, I'm gonna introduce the key findings regarding the actual access to mental health services. So we can go to the next slide, PG. When we say access to mental health services, we include not only access to the services of psychologists and psychiatrists, but also social workers and outreach workers when they actually in their function of supporting mental health. So we have two big results across the 4 countries. The first one is again about stigma, and we found that stigma is a great deterrent from seeking support, and that's very crucial, of even when you access support, not disclosing sex work with the practitioners. And stigma in this context is precisely defined as the fear of being judged by the practitioners or of being filed as a sex worker in public records, so public authority records or public health authorities. I would pass this to the next one. This is particularly this record and fear of being filed is very true and very real for Sweden and the UK, as we will see in a moment. The second point is the fact that for migrant sex workers in particular, accessing mental health support is severely hindered by lack of valid documents, lack of information about existing services, and language. So, for instance, Atis, who is a Black, Indigenous person of color, trans, female, and working as an escort in Germany, and the migrant, she says, I can't access to services here because I don't have an insurance. I'm not covered by the HNS and NHS, which is, or the equivalent public service in Germany, and I don't have money to see a private counselor or something. I don't think I can deal by myself with my mental health problems. Can you hear me? Are we okay? Yes. Okay. So can we go to the next one? Now, regarding the overall experiences of mental health services by sex workers, our findings indicate that among these 118 sex workers we have interviewed, who are also, let's remember, sex workers who have experiences of mental health issues and need, therefore, support. Of these, 86% access some form of mental health support, while 14 had no access whatsoever because of lack of trust, documents, or information. Now, it's important to understand that of these 86% who accessed, only 88 disclosed sex work, at least to some practitioner that they encountered. And it is very interesting and depressing, or somehow hard to see that of those who accessed and disclosed their sex work, only less than half, so 42%, experienced good mental health provision, while 58% who disclosed had judgmental and stigmatizing experiencing and found the help detrimental. Now, it's important to see that the vast majority of those who had negative experiences were actually had access through the public health system, and vice versa. Those who had good experiences while disclosing their sex work are people who had, for the mass majority, so 73%, had access to specialized projects for sex workers or for LGBTQI people or people using drugs or people living with HIV. A small part, 15%, instead had paid for private practitioners, and only 12%, so a really slight minority, had access to the good public psychiatric care. As we will see, Sweden represents an exception in the sense that in Sweden, also specialized projects for sex workers and for drug users are very judgmental and not helpful for the people we have interviewed. Okay, we can now say something about each country. So starting with Germany, we are in a context that is of legalization. Let's remember that our data collection is until 2017, and in 2017 there was a big change in the legislation, starting in June with the Prostitutes Protection Act, which is more restrictive, has been more restrictive for sex workers' lives and work. So up to that point anyway, so our research is previous to the new piece of legislation, we found relatively good results in Germany, with 25 out of 30 sex workers having access to some useful and non-judgmental professional support, which includes outreach projects or private counselors, which can be covered by insurance or not. And also most interviewed participants had access to peer sex worker communities and considered that was crucial for their mental health. However, we found that structural barriers were very important in terms of economic resources, migration, housing, language, and that there is a specific problem linked to privatization of the health system in Germany, which produces great exclusions for many sex workers, and even more particularly migrant sex workers. As I said, it's important to go back to Germany and produce more research to see that to evaluate the impact of the new law, which is most likely negative on sex workers' health. Okay, so Yes.
I am sorry, I'm just going to interrupt. There was a mistake in one of the quotes that you said it was written from Germany, but the NHS is not from Germany. So they feared registration from the NHS, which is the UK public health system.
Yeah, I was confused. Perfect. So which makes sense, because actually the risk of being filed is very real in the UK and in Sweden, and less so in Germany. In fact, previously to 2017 in any case. So speaking of Italy, the legal context is a form of partial criminalization where sex work is not criminalized as such, but actually in practice, soliciting and profiting are often criminalized, as well as indoor work. And it's important to stress that our great research assistant, which I think is here, I don't know, Aura, are you here? She should be here, but maybe she's not, to answer questions and so on, had access to a sample which included a very high number of undocumented migrants, who therefore, in the context of Italy, are subjected to very high forms of violence and poverty, and also public authority violence. So in this, having said that, we found that out of 28, 18 accessed free support with specific outreach services for sex workers or migrants or drug users, and found it useful. So only 3 out of 30 never accessed any support service. It's also important to stress that the data collection took place in a region of Italy which is relatively good, Emilia-Romagna, in terms of services it offers to sex workers and drug users and migrants, and in general public health services. Anyway, most sex workers, even if they had this support that they found useful in terms of their mental health, found it really insufficient in terms of their economic and social needs. And they reported very little access to peer networks, unfortunately. We can go to the case of the UK, where the legal framework is somehow not so different from Italy, so for partial criminalization. In this context, a vast majority accessed services, all but 2. And those who access specialized services for sex workers or private counselors had good experiences. Instead, those who accessed the NHS, so the National Health Service, had more difficult experiences. In fact, all but 1 had judgmental experience, and 7 decided not to disclose out of fear, as I said, of being reported, judged, but also, filed. And so what does that mean? It means that, in fact, in the NHS, at least as it was until the beginning of 2017, if I, as a sex worker, go to a service and say that I, many things, and I also speak about my work life, this information can be transmitted to other part of the health system. So I go to a different doctor and I find that this doctor actually knows about my sex work practice. Instead, a good point about the UK is that, at least for this particular sample of sex workers, they accessed peer support networks and they found it crucial for their well-being. Instead, generally, sex workers report to be strongly affected in their mental health by poverty, housing, and documents, as well as isolation and language barriers. I now pass the floor to Ofelia Glentino, who is going to introduce the case of Sweden and as well as our conclusion for the project. Thank you.
Hi. So I'm Ophelia, and I was the peer researcher for the Swedish part of the project. And as you maybe know, in Sweden, the legal framework is that we have client criminalization, the so-called Swedish or Nordic model, and a lot of other aspects of sex work is also criminalized. And Sweden was the country in this research where sex workers experienced the most stigma with practitioners. 6 out of 30 sex workers did not access any form of service, and 4 out of those 6 were migrants. This is quite common for Sweden, like the lack of support for migrants is quite extreme, I would say. 24 of the people we talked to accessed some form of service, and out of those, only 15 disclosed that they were sex workers. And of those who told their mental health practitioners, only 3 had non-stigmatizing experience. So that's pretty bad statistics. Both private and public mental health practitioners, as well as specialized projects for sex workers, display pathologization towards sex workers, as well as lack of confidentiality, and they also pressure sex workers to quit sex work. Like I said before, serious lack of services for migrant sex workers. And mental health practitioners, when we talk to them, they make a very clear-cut difference between 2 groups of sex workers, local and migrant sex workers. For the local sex workers, they see sex work as primarily related to trauma and never like an economic need. Whereas for migrants, they see poverty, it's always seen as it's probably pimping, trafficking, but it's never spoken of as mental health related. In Sweden, out of these 4 countries, Sweden, with its like on-demand legislation, had the worst outcomes when it comes to quality mental health support, as well as to peer and community networks. And when I did all these interviews, there wasn't really a strong sex worker community in Sweden, and I think that's changed a bit in the past few years. So that's good news for Sweden. I'm gonna just read one quote from a migrant street-based sex worker in Sweden. She had been actually in contact with a few different services, but she said she never told anyone about the depression. The best support in Sweden? Not any. Another person here talks about that the lack is the biggest mental health issue is the lack of peer support. And another person says that a problem is that the therapist is just like all the other PC people in Sweden. They think that all sex workers are victims. All right. So if we move back to the whole project, not to Sweden, what do sex workers want? Here are some ideas that our participants told us about. Many call for the decriminalization of sex work, and many call for special training about sex work for mental health professionals. Many would like improvement or development of peer-led or peer-inclusive specialized services in their own language, so multilingual services. And some suggested incentivizing sex workers themselves to train as mental health practitioners. Okay, so just very short, our conclusions from the Sex Work and Mental Health project. 1, sex work is not per se a cause of mental health problems, yet violence and bad working conditions can be harmful to sex workers' mental health. 2, sex work may be experienced as beneficial and provide financial stability to people who are excluded from the labor market because of their mental health needs. 3, experiencing judgment and stigma by mental health practitioners, including in the form of being understood as victims, is detrimental to sex workers' mental health. And 4, there's a direct link between the direct or indirect criminalization of sex work and really bad access to good quality mental health support for sex workers who experience mental health problems. All right. Here's a quote that sums it up, like all these different information that we got quite well in one quote. A lot of people with mental health issues work in the sex industry because capitalism is very unkind to people who are not compatible with the society it creates. I think sex work can be positive for mental health because a big health concern is loneliness and lack of personal connection. And I think the intimacy that comes with sex work can be very positive for people. And I think the violence and stigma some people face regularly can be really terrible for their mental health. All right. So we just want to say thank you to ESWA and to Sebastian Köhn from OSF and Simon Vigdatz from HYDRA. Our full report is available on the website, and that's where we also have a full list of recommendations from the project. But we didn't include them in the presentation today because they overwhelmingly overlap with the ones that will be presented by ESWA today. So stay tuned for that. I'm very excited to hear.
Excellent. Thank you, PG, Giulia, Ophelia, for sharing your research findings. Sex work is both a means to manage mental health and also detrimental if you don't control your working conditions. Really important stuff around access and discrimination shared there. Thank you very much. Next up, we have Jules from the European Sex Worker Rights Alliance presenting their policy paper. Jules, take it away.
Yes, thank you, Raven. I'm going to share my screen. Yes, hi everyone. So I'm Jules James. I'm the program officer of ESWA, the European Sex Workers' Rights Alliance. And I especially work on health and also on mental health. So I'm going to present you our pilot program on sex work and mental health that we developed to support sex workers' mental health during the pandemic. So this program has been financed by ILGA Europe and is consists in two different kinds of activities. One focused on offering sessions to sex workers, but also non-sex workers. And the second activity, we developed a briefing paper and a toolkit. So I'm going to present you this. So we first had sessions on sex work and mental health. We had two different kinds of sessions. First, we had thematic webinar sessions. Those were open to all ESWA members, whether they were sex workers or not. And the idea was to give tools about different topics related to mental health. And we had 5 sessions on different topics such as anxiety, sexual violence, or body image. We also had every other week closed support sessions. So those were reserved for a close group of LGBTI sex workers' rights activists. So the group was formed at the beginning of the project and it remained the same until the end. And there, the idea was for the people in the group to exchange with peers while being supported by certified therapists. So I have, we also developed resources on sex work and mental health, a briefing paper and a toolkit. And I realized in my previous slide that I forgot to actually add the pictures, but I will show you at the end. So we developed first a briefing paper, which is an advocacy tool for the inclusion of sex workers in service provision. And this briefing paper is dedicated to everyone, including sex workers' rights activists, but especially for mental health care professionals, mental health care institutions, government, policymakers, funders, and so on. And we also developed a toolkit that was more to help disseminating tools and principles about psychological first aid to every organization that works with the sex worker community. So I'm going to present you more the briefing paper on sex work and mental health, which is an overview of the factors impacting sex workers' mental health and their access to services in Europe and Central Asia. To realize this briefing paper, we had 3 forms of data collection. So first, we did a desk research and realized that there is actually very little resources on the topic. Fortunately, there was the research led by PG, Ophelia, Giulia, and Nick. We also did an e-consultation that was sent to all our members, and we got an answer from 16 of our members onto 18 questions. And we also had focus groups to go a bit more in depth in the topic. We did it both in English and in Russian because we realized with the e-consultation that a lot of sex workers and sex worker organizations couldn't participate because of the language barriers. So we decided to also have it in Russian. Those focus groups were for sex workers only. So the briefing paper that you can see is supposed to have a picture on one side is divided into 4 sections. I'm going to first talk about the factors that are impacting the mental health of sex workers. So here you see a graph. What's important to look at is the pink bars. And we see the biggest factors that are impacting the mental health of sex workers, according to our respondents, is societal stigma, the financial situation, and also transphobia for more than 80% of the respondents. But we also see that there are other factors that are very important, such as housing, for example, or violence. So it's very aligned with the report that was presented just before. So stigma is one of the biggest factors. And when I talk about stigma, it's mostly stigma around sex work. And it takes the form of the fear of being outed and having to live a double life. And it has an impact on social isolation and feeling lonely. And also with stigma, we see that sex workers are seen as victims, which is very detrimental to their mental health. But stigma also concerns other intersecting identities, such as class, race, and ethnicity, sexual orientation and gender identity, drug use, disabilities, and even mental health itself. And it is related to other structural factors, such as criminalization, for example. I'm not going to read you the quote to be a bit faster. So stigma is very linked with the criminalization of sex work, with the legal status around sex work. And here it's about the criminalization not only of sex work, but also of third parties or clients. And I took this quote from the report that's actually very telling about why it impacts the mental health of sex workers, because criminalizing sex work sends the clear message that sex work is not work and that sex workers are either criminals or powerless victims, unable to make decisions about themselves. So we can imagine how this impacts the mental health of sex workers. We also, in relation with stigma and criminalization, there is also, of course, violence. Because under criminalization, there is a lower negotiating power for sex workers, which expose them to higher risk of violence and to higher risk of exploitative working conditions, which are detrimental to the mental health. And within violence, we also observed the impact of police violence, especially in countries where it's criminalized. Which criminalized. Sex workers who are at the intersection of different identities also face more factors that are going to impact their mental health. Transphobia accounted for 83% of our respondents as a factor that impacts the mental health of sex workers to a very great extent, but also homophobia, biphobia, lesbophobia to 60%. And also for undocumented migrants, they face higher stigma and higher rates of violence, more unstable housing, and also the fear of deportation. We also observed other structural factors, like has been said also on the previous presentation. For example, we can imagine that when one's fear losing child's custody, it is impacting their mental health. Same for unstable housing, precarious financial situation, and also bad working condition. Now I'm going to talk about the second part of the report, which is the access to mental health services for sex workers. So here's the same graph. We see that the biggest factors that are faced by sex workers in accessing appropriate mental health care is the lack of knowledge and the stigma around sex work within the mental health care. So this takes the form of an over-pathologization and systematic association between sex work and mental health issues. And this leads to also sex workers being pressured to leave sex work. But we also observed something that was quite shocking, is that there is a breach of confidentiality by therapists. We had like a respondent that said that they were that it was written in their folder that they were doing sex work, and this can lead to legal consequences. Think about undocumented migrants that can face deportation, or for parent sex workers whose child can be taken away from them. And all this lack of knowledge and stigma around sex work leads to also an internalized stigma, with sex workers feeling bad about themselves. I have this quote on the right side that really says it all, that someone has been in the mental health care system for over 10 years and thought that she was a bad patient simply because she was a sex worker. So all this will lead to distrust from sex workers to mental health care professionals, and the refusal to simply seek help because they think that they cannot be helped anyway. And for sex workers facing intersecting identities, there are even bigger obstacles in accessing mental health services. For example, for undocumented migrants, there is the lack of health insurance, but also another layer of the lack of knowledge and stigma around gender and gender expression for trans sex workers, sexual orientation, race and cultural differences, and also a stigma around substance use. And it was also reported that it was difficult for sex workers to find therapists with the appropriate language skills. But sex workers and sex worker organizations have set up coping strategies and initiatives to help with mental health. We will see that later, more in depth in the second part of the webinar, but I'm just going to tell you a bit about what we wrote. So a lot of sex workers shared examples of self-care as simple as having a pet or buying oneself flowers or going for a walk in the nature as self-care, as coping strategies to improve their mental health. And the key thing that that we heard also was the importance of peer support and community network for sex workers to alleviate their mental health, to have a place where they can talk with each other. And also this support from the community, it can be directed directly at mental health with different initiatives, but also indirectly when sex worker organizations offer health services, for example, like STI testing or help with gender affirming treatments or help with finding a place to sleep. All these, of course, impact the mental health of sex workers as well. So we wrote also some recommendations, for example, to mental health care professionals and structures. So please do not assume that sex work is the reason for our mental health issues, and listen to the sex worker clients. It's also recommended to always apply the code of conduct related to confidentiality and to not write down that the client is doing sex work if they don't want to, because of the stigma around it. We also advise mental health care structures and professionals to deconstruct their bias around sex work, but also around sex, around gender and gender roles, around race, sexual orientation, and drug use. And for structures to also set up trainings for the therapists run by sex workers. Then we have other recommendations that are not new, said over and over again to governments. Decriminalize sex work, will help sex workers' mental health, recognize sex work as work, and provide access to labor rights, but also consulting and involving sex workers in policies, fund sex worker-led organizations, but also measures such as implementing a firewall between immigration authorities and health services will help migrant sex workers to reach out to health services, mental health or regular health care. And of course, to direct more funding into the healthcare system, but also into sex worker-led healthcare structures and to sex worker organization providing trainings. And other recommendations. So it's again funding more sex worker-led networks, be national, regional, or global networks, consult the sex workers, and also for researchers to involve sex workers in all the steps of the research around sex work, to pay sex workers for the labor and expertise. You have no idea how many times we're asked for a week to provide input for research and all this for free. And also to ensure the dissemination of the research finding beyond academic circles, because this is going to help towards decriminalization. So that was it about the briefing paper. About the toolkit. The toolkit was also divided into different parts. So in the first parts, we talk. So this toolkit is more for sex workers' rights activists to deal with very practical things. So we talk about what is mental health, what is a mental health crisis, and what to do when there is a mental health crisis. So, for example, one thing very basic, but it's to differentiate mental health and mental illness, because one can have good mental health and a mental illness, and also a good mental health without, or bad mental health without having a mental illness. We also talk about how to recognize signs of a mental health crisis and what to do then. And we also present sex worker-led initiatives that will be developed in the second part of the webinar. With three, they're all grouped into three different chapters. So how does it work? What are the resources needed? And what are examples? The idea is that other sex worker organizations can look at this toolkit and look at these initiatives and reproduce them. So we have initiatives with very different budgets, from meetups for sex workers to a list of sex workers friendly therapists or free counseling for sex workers. And we also provide resources on how to deal with anxiety, sexual and physical violence, addictive and compulsive behaviors, and drug dependency, suicidal thoughts, body image, and well-being. So now we are at the end of our of this pilot program. We still have an awareness campaign that we are launching today with this webinar about sex work and mental health. So you're welcome to go on our website, and to on the first page you will see this campaign, and you can sign the pledge and share it. And with this campaign, we also strongly recommend you to read the briefing paper and the toolkit, and to talk about it around you, about what you discovered there. So I want to thank you, all the sex workers and the sex worker organizations, all the ESWA members that have been part in this research, and also Yolanta and Sakib, who are the certified therapists of the program. Of course, the team of ESWA, Sabrina, our new coordinator, who will be speaking later, Irena, Yeats, but also Giulia, who did all the communication around it, and Luca, who accompanied me in this first project that I led within ESWA. And I also want to thank PG, who reviewed our paper and spent a lot of time on it. So thank you for that. And our translator, translators as well. Ambrose, who did all the little drawings, also for the awareness campaign. Sophie, who did the design. Veronica, who helped with the campaign. And ILGA Europe for supporting us financially. So this is it for the presentation.
Sure.
And
Thank you, Jules.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jules. Thank you, PG. Thank you, Giulia. Thank you, Ophelia, for your beautiful, informative presentation today. And now we'll move to the Q&A. I saw that some questions were already answered, but please submit your questions to the Q&A, and Jules, if you wanted to help coordinate that, or how you wanted to help facilitate that, but I can read some of the questions. Or
sure, go ahead.
Some of them have been answered quickly. Okay. People are talking about access to the PowerPoint. Absolutely. We'll be sharing slides, the reports available.
Yes.
Okay, there are no open questions at the moment.
Someone wrote, can you explain the relation between these two projects? Actually, very little in a sense. Like, those projects were separate projects. I just for me, in writing the briefing paper, I use a lot of the findings of their research in my desk research, and that's pretty much it. Right? Do you have anything to add, PG?
Yeah, this our research actually took place between 2016 and 2018, and then because of international transfers of mine and another researcher, and for several unrelated reasons, it took a long time for us to go through the data. So it was completely separate to this one. I just happened to be also a member of ESWA, and I helped with the reviewing of the beautiful report by Jules, but there was no connection otherwise.
Okay, there is a question in here. An attendee asks about, you mentioned sex worker friendly therapist therapy. Is there anything specific that would make therapy or therapist sex worker friendly? Is there something that would be recommended for therapists to be acquainted with?
I think we will see that a bit more later in the project that will be presented by George. Right? Yeah,
absolutely. Unless anyone here has anything to add about that.
Yeah, I would like to add something to the fact that I think it is one thing that brings together these two projects is, I think, a very important passage from a moment in which sex workers were pathologized and assumed to have mental health problems by other people, and which produced a further level of stigmatization and also a silencing of the actual mental health problems that sex workers, like everybody else, can have, to a moment in which actually the sex worker movement and peer-led research can open up the box and just own the terms of this conversation. I think this is a very important moment, because the risk is always that other people will talk instead of sex workers, and that also the real issues that might be there are not discussed. It's the same thing that happened with trafficking. For many, many years, trafficking was a discursive box that only abolitionists talked about, and many people on the sex worker side hesitated to talk about it in order not to give it further fuel. And now I think a similar shift has happened. So this was just my reflection. I think that it's a very important moment, and it's a very important outcome that there is this switch in terms of power and who owns the discourse.
That's right. And who develops the responses, because okay, so there is a question in here about whether the results are published in peer-reviewed journals. We'd like to take that. And then people want references, and you can see that in the report, I guess, when you read it.
Not yet, but we are working on it. It's also important. You're right. So we will do it. We are doing it, but we will let you know, of course. Also, I'm going to put the links here so everybody can be sure to have the report accessible, downloadable on top of these slides of the presentation.
Someone said Sage will be in touch. I don't know if that's Sage Journals or not. Okay, best way to get a hold of Giulia. Someone will respond to that.
And there was a question about the countries included in the briefing paper published by ESWA. So the consultation was open to all our members our members are based in Europe and Central Asia. We didn't get an answer from everyone, but right now, out of my head, I can say we had responses from the UK, France, Germany, from Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Sweden, Finland, Portugal, Spain, maybe more.
Excellent. As there are no more questions, does anyone have any final burning comments, or the panelists would like to get something in before we proceed to the next section? Nothing burning. Someone raised a question about recommendations. Sorry. There's a question about recommendations. I missed it.
I can see it. So it's a question from Brian. Since there are two distinct studies, will there be any merging of the separate recommendations into one platform or one set of tasks? I think there will be the research on sex work and mental health has a specific platform. Let me know if I'm wrong. And our recommendations are going to be on ESWA's website, but I don't think we plan on any merging platform, like any one platform for both. We can, of course, refer to each other's research, but
Yeah, I wanted to add that maybe our research is available online, the report on our website, which is sexworkmentalhealth.org, but it will be in the presentation. And it has recommendations that are country specific. Otherwise, the general recommendations are really overlapping with those of the ESWA report. I think the ESWA report goes beyond them, so they are even more detailed. But otherwise, they're overlapping, and we are more detailed in the different countries, possibly. But yeah, they are separate.
But I think there is a lot of work to be done right now to present together and really try and promote these results together, because I think they really reinforce each other and they add. I mean, I was very, very happy to hear about your research, because you go more in certain aspects which we haven't developed. So I think they really complement each other, and I think it's really time to share it. Well, I'm thinking really about the mental health communities, which could be open for a change. You know, we had some comments on the chat, but let's coordinate for real on that one.
Excellent. Okay, well, I believe that there concludes part one. So we'd like to thank all of the presenters and attendees and translators, and we'll just hold shortly. We'll begin part two. And thank you very much. And you can continue the dialogue at the end of part two. Thank you, everyone.
And so I think we can keep it, we leave it open, and then we start at 12:30.
So 13 minutes.
Yeah.
Excellent.
May I? I'm sorry to take word. I wanted to apologize because it's very late for me, and I will have to go. I've had my baby crying for the whole time I was presenting. So if I was a bit nervous, I was hearing the cry here. But I really need to get some sleep. I am definitely going to watch the recording. Let's work together. I'm very sad that I'm not hearing the most important part, which is from the community. Let's work together, especially to create really some tools for practitioners, which is one of the questions that we had from the audience. That would be great to produce them. And thank you so much, everyone, for organizing this. Thank you. Bye, and good night on my side of the world. My head is upside down compared to yours. Bye.
PG.
Ciao.
Take care of yourself.
Good night.
Buonanotte.
Good night.
Buonanotte.
I would like to extend my thanks to all of the incredible speakers we had during the first half of the session, to Ophelia, to Jules, to Giulia, and to PG. Thank you so much for all of the amazing work that you have done and for sharing that all with us. And also thank you to everybody who has asked questions, who's engaged so far, and hopefully there will be plenty more opportunity for discussion coming up in the second half of today's session. So as part of the second half of today's session, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at 3 different projects across Europe that have applied all of these fantastic learnings that have been shared with us in the first half of today's session, whether that is purposefully applying those learnings or whether that's just doing projects with the same sort of ethos. We're going to be talking about what we can learn from these projects and how these findings can be implemented in different ways. So first of all, I'm going to introduce myself and just say hi. I'm Rosie. I am the Executive Assistant at National Ugly Mugs. I'm also a university lecturer and I'm also a sex worker. So my experience is coming at this from many, many different angles. And that's all you probably need to know about me. And I'm going to introduce our first speaker. And our first speaker is coming very close to home for me. It is the amazing George Lewis. George has been involved with sex worker rights and service provision for over 25 years in various roles throughout the UK and also throughout Europe. He is a qualified solution-focused hypnotherapist. He's got his own practice in Edinburgh in Scotland, and the main focus of his work is helping people who have issues with anxiety, depression, and stress. And the main part of his work that he's going to be talking about today is his work as the Mental Health Support Services Coordinator at National Ugly Mugs. So I will hand over to George and he'll tell you all about the work that we've been doing here at NUM.
Thanks, Rosie. Am I on? Can I see myself? Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thanks for that introduction, Rosie. I'll try and live up to it. Yeah. Can I also extend my thanks to everybody who spoke earlier on? Yeah. It's been brilliant work, and hopefully on the ground, we're as Rosie says, we're going to either by accident or design achieve the outcomes that they've been leading us to. Today, I'd like to take you through the various resources that we've been working on at NUM over the past year or so. As a result of COVID-related funding, which I don't know, Raven might be able to shed some more light on, we're able to develop mental health resources in a way that we previously hadn't been able to. As we all know, the mental health of sex workers has often been seen as ranking below or behind physical health, sexual health, but what COVID's done is allowed us, or forced us even, to shine a light and direct our attentions to mental health in a way that we haven't been able to before. So what I'd like to do, I'd like to take you to our website, and apologies, I'm not the most technically proficient person in the world, but here we have our mental health resources landing page. Tells us a little bit of the background, but I want to take you through the various resources that we have. You see, the first thing that we have there is our casework support. Now, those of you that have worked with NUM in the past will know that casework support is at the heart of everything that NUM does. For those of you who don't know, their main task is to is to provide help to sex workers who've been the victims of crime in the course of their work, as it says there. I could probably devote an entire session in telling you what they actually do, but I've only got 10 minutes. But you will see, you can guess how important they are to NUM, but you'll also see their potential importance to sex workers who are struggling with their mental health. They are, after all, the first point of contact with NUM for many. We've then gone on to develop some specific resources. The first of these is around grief and loss, which I'm going to briefly put up on the screen. Now, these resources, we've designed them in such a way that they can be seen easily on phones as well as obviously on laptops, but they're downloadable and just makes it a good deal more accessible. Lots of points in there. Again, I'm time limited here, so I would like to spend a lot more time on each of the resources. But you'll see there's some specific sections there. For example, when might sex workers grieve? Self-care while grieving. All of them very, very useful in terms of grief and loss. And of course, over the last year and a half, most of us have been exposed to some sort of grief or loss of lots of different types, whether that be personal or whether it just be loss of income, and which is going to cause anxiety and grief as well. And there's lots of stuff there. I'm just going to flick through it at the very end, as well as explanations and background. There's lots of advice there. Tell your co-workers, tell clients or don't, knowing your escape routes, getting space to grieve, as well as lots of resources at the end. Where can I go? And of course, for sex workers, that's going to be to us, basically. So that's the first of our resources. Very brief overview. The other one we have is on suicide awareness and prevention. Now, this is designed for two situations. One is for those who are experiencing suicidal thoughts themselves, but also acts as a guide to spotting suicidal thoughts in others. Again, if we look at the contents page, fairly comprehensive in terms of what to do if it's you, what to do if it's a colleague, a friend, a co-worker, as well as listing at the very end there additional resources. Also talks about finding a therapist, and we'll come on to that in a second. But one part there we've actually highlighted elsewhere is making a safety plan. Those who are experts in suicide awareness tell us that this is very, very important. Now, this, again, it's downloadable for yourself if you're struggling or if you're spotting suicidal thoughts in others. Safety plan is a very, very useful thing. Very, very useful thing to have. And it's something that perhaps people can download and have handy, even if they're not experiencing those kind of thoughts. Because as we all know, mental health issues can strike at any time, and it's handy to have these things at hand, I would suggest. Next thing we want to talk about is our directory of sex worker friendly therapists. Now, it's been mentioned already. How do you define sex worker friendly therapy? We could probably spend the rest of the day having that discussion. We started off on that road of defining sex worker friendly therapy, and we quickly realized it was going to take us far too long to come to a conclusion, especially when there was a need to get something out there. So what we ended up doing was saying to therapists who were interested in providing support to sex workers, can you sign up to this particular statement I've got on the screen just now, as well as our own core values. If you can, you can be on our directory. If you can't, sorry, we don't want to work with you. Now there are limitations to that, and it's limiting in itself. And I'll come on to how we're going to address those limitations later on. But just having a quick look at the directory itself, what we have, some basic details of therapists who have signed up to our core values, contact details, what type of therapy they offer, as well as website details. Excuse me a second, just have a little drink here. You also see that some therapists have an asterisk against their name. These are therapists that have agreed to provide what we're calling our NUM packages. Now, these are specifically designed for those sex workers who can't afford to pay for their therapy. So what we've agreed with those particular therapists is that they will provide a package initially of 3 sessions. And as I say, a sex worker doesn't pay for those. NUM will pay the therapist for 2 of the sessions, and the 3rd session will be free. So in other words, we're having therapists who are providing 3 sessions for the price of 2. We also, sorry, I'm just lost my place a little bit. Yeah. Well, yeah, back to me now. Sorry. We also, that one of the other things we did during the spring was we ran a series of group sessions which were open to sex workers, to therapists, to anybody who was interested, students, and these were on a range of topics, led by therapists themselves, but open, as I say, to anybody who had an interest. Topics that we covered were emotional regulations and how to look after your mental health, an introduction to hypnotherapy for dealing with stress, anxiety, depression. No prizes for guessing who led that one. Understanding grief and loss. Introduction to dialectical behaviour therapy skills for surviving a crisis, and my own particular favourite, we've touched on it a couple of times already, sex worker friendly therapy. What does it look like? We hope to be able to run some more of these sessions in the future, but of course we're limited by funding and by capacity. But they were, I'm going to say, there was success in terms of the engagement with people. Everybody who attended engaged with the discussions in a way that was really quite heartening. Sometimes the discussions went in directions that we didn't expect them to, or weren't necessarily related to the topic at hand. But yes, they gave us lots of food for thought for the future. On the future, the resources that we have, they are a work in progress. We know that. We will be modifying them, adding to them as time goes on, but based always on reactions and feedback from the community, from sex workers, from our therapists. But just to take you through a few things that we're currently doing. The directory is very basic, and we want it to be more sophisticated. One obvious thing that we're just doing right this very minute, we just have websites there, because when we compiled the directory, everybody was working online. Now, of course, therapists are starting to see clients face to face, and so there's an obvious modification we need to make to the directory in that respect. But further, it doesn't, for example, tell us who is best able to support, for example, sex workers of colour or transgender sex workers. That's something we are currently working on. We also want it to be more user-friendly. At the moment, we're asking sex workers who are in crisis to do their own research on therapists. We don't vet the therapists. We just say that they have signed up to our core values. But we're asking sex workers to do that research at a time when they just might not be able to do so. So what we're doing is, with casework support, we're exploring ways of making things easier for sex workers to navigate. It's also been suggested to us by a number of people that sex workers would prefer to know that their own particular therapist has sex work experience. Now, that's a difficult one to facilitate, given the need to protect professional, personal boundaries. However, we know it's something we need to explore and find a solution to. And of course, there's lots of you out there. If somebody has found that solution, please. That's what this kind of forum is about. Is about swapping information. So yeah, that's something we are not struggling with. We're working with just now, trying to find some kind of solution that suits everybody. We also want to develop training for therapists from basic sex work in the law, because, without full understanding of the law or the law around sex work, how can a therapist actually provide proper support? But from basic things like that to more detailed topics, we feel that we can raise the quality of what's being offered in terms of support, even if that means reducing the quantity, reducing the numbers in the directory. I'm sure you agree that the quality of support is much more important than having a long list of therapists. We're also exploring resources for sex worker mental health and disabilities, because this ties in with our mission statement in terms of ending all forms of violence against sex workers. And we're also about to launch Silver Cloud, which is a very exciting development. For those of you who aren't aware of it, Silver Cloud is an online program based on cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. Again, I could spend a much longer time on this, but in essence, it's a free service, or should I say, it's a service that's free to sex workers. It's not free to us. We paid a lot of money for this, but it's a service that's free to sex workers, which allows them to work through a CBT program at their own pace, either supported by us or self-supported. We've been trialing it at our own pace, which is slowly, but that's because we want to get it right. But we hope to be in a position to launch it very soon. To sum up, therefore, we've made a start in the resources, but we know that there's a long way to go, and we're always looking for feedback and suggestions in order to improve what we're doing. As I say, it's events like today's that are very helpful from that point of view, to get different perspectives and experiences. So please feel free when the time for the Q&A comes. Please feel free to let us know your thoughts. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, George. We've just had one question that I am going to put to you now, simply because it's very much based on NUM stuff. And the question is from Natalie. Do you check the therapists apart from being friendly, as in making sure that there's no sort of complaints or anything like that against them?
We haven't done any vetting at all so far. When we started out, it was largely a case of let's get something out there, and if they can sign up to our core values, then they will be in. But I take your point. We haven't really had the resources or the capacity to check every single therapist. We would like to be able to, of course we would. But this is where I think the training comes in, where there has been talk about perhaps having some kind of NUM qualification or something along those lines. It's not a fully formed thought yet, but some kind of vetting by training. Whether we charge for that or whether we don't, that's another discussion we need to have. But the short answer to your question is no. We haven't done any further vetting than what we've already done.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, George. And I am now going to be moving on to our second speaker of today, and that is Nadia Zilkin. Nadia works as a health advisor at Hydra EV, which is based in Berlin, and she's also active in the Sex Worker Action Group there. She combines her academic knowledge in European and international law and politics with her many experiences in activism, political and youth education, and full-service sex work to fight whorephobia, slut-shaming, and discrimination in general. And she is going to be telling us all about what Hydra EV have been doing in terms of sex workers' rights and mental health for sex workers based in Berlin.
Yes, hello everybody. Let me just quickly share my screen. I'm going to be talking about the project Acute Help for Trauma. Just checking. Can you see the screen now? It should work. Yes? Okay, perfect. Then let me start the presentation. Yes, there we go. Okay, all righty. So, hello everyone. Yeah, I'm Nadia. Thank you for the nice introduction for this amazing event. I'm going to be talking about the project Akute Traumahilfe, in German, just in English, Acute Help for Trauma, which we're doing at the Hydra e.V. in Berlin. Just as a quick context information for those who haven't heard of Hydra, this is an association since 1980, an association with sex workers and social workers. And this association basically runs a counseling center on the one hand, but also a sex worker cafe, which functions more as a community space and as a space for sex workers to learn all kinds of like sex work related knowledge, from how to dirty talk to consent workshops, etc., etc. And part of the counseling and the services that we offer to sex workers in the counseling center as well as in the cafe relates to this project Acute Help for Trauma. So just to give a quick overview over what I'm going to talk about. First of all, I'm going to talk about the origins of the project, like how it developed, where it comes from. I'm going to talk about the structure, like how the project is built and structured, then problems we run into, and conclusions that we have drawn so far. And then in the end, if there's time for questions, obviously. So, to talk about the origins of Acute Help for Trauma, it's a result of the Roundtable Sex Work in Berlin, which happened in 2019, where various sex worker organizations, counseling centers, etc., actors within Berlin came together to talk and reflect about sex workers' rights and the accesses to healthcare sex workers have, which is why this project also resulted from the roundtable, because strengthening accesses to the health sector for sex workers was definitely like a focus point of the roundtable. And if we want to be like super positive and optimistic, we can look at it that the project is an attempt to accommodate the lived realities of sex workers within structures that do not always take them into account. So rather than this top-down approach and framing of like, oh, people have to jump through these and these hoops in order to access these and these healthcare services, instead it was reframed a little bit more like, okay, how can we build bridges or create accesses to the healthcare system that are necessary. And if you want to be super optimistic, we can also look at it as in, or interpret the project and also the discussions at the roundtable in such a way that maybe there's even the acknowledgement that mental health matters equally as other aspects of health, which has been mentioned already by the former speaker, or the speaker before me. To move on to the structure of the project, Acute Help for Trauma. So the first pillar and which is like the most central and I suppose not basic, but also most repeating work, are the referrals into psychological stabilizing short-term treatment. So in this project, my job at Hydra is to refer sex workers who say they want to benefit or make use of the project to fitting therapists that will grant them a maximum of 10 sessions, therapy sessions to like stabilize the person. As in, it's not necessarily about going into the actual trauma work, but it's about checking what does that person need and what tools can that person learn to self-regulate, to deal with the acute crisis in order to make the necessary next steps, or in order to come up with a plan and make more informed decisions about their life and how they want to continue in their individual situation. Because everything is covered and the whole bureaucracy, etc., is run by the project, these referrals can take place even if the sex worker doesn't have health insurance, or even if the sex worker in question is illegalized, which is great and very helpful, because as long as the access to Hydra is there and the person knows about this project and is willing to go into this stabilizing short-term psychological treatment, a lot of other hurdles or structural issues or factors to exclude people can be avoided. Because we don't have to first like figure the whole healthcare situation and accesses to the system out. We can offer tangible short-term help without having to fulfill any specific requirements. The second pillar of the project refers to sensitizing and training medical or counseling staff, doctors and therapists in particular. Why I'm mentioning medical and counseling staff and doctors as well is because we have the workshop structured. We have like a basic workshop that happens in cooperation with another project that resulted out of the roundtable sex work, that focuses more on doctors and gynecologists in particular. So in cooperation with that project and other sex worker educated or active sex worker referees or people who do the workshops with us, we do a basic training or a workshop in like the foundational knowledge when dealing with sex work in a health-related sector. And then we have an additional workshop that builds upon like the foundational workshop that is particular just for therapists. And we give preferential treatments to the therapists who cooperate with us in the project. But also that workshop is not exclusively only for those therapists, where we go into a lot more closer to reality and more personal and connected de-stigma work, or like reflecting one's own prejudices or dimensions of discrimination that still have to be dissected and reflected, which is helpful in training and educating medical staff and particularly therapists and for dealing with sex workers. But obviously it's also just one part of a process that everybody has to go through for themselves as well. After the workshops, we also offer an individualized exchange opportunity between the therapists and sex workers. So we pay sex workers to go through some kind of like evaluation, questionnaire. I'm lacking the word. Basically, to ask evaluative questions about the experience of the therapist, of the project in itself, the work with the clients that we refer, and also with the workshops, if there are open questions, or if they need tips or maybe some literature recommendation, what they have to read up on or still need to educate themselves on. And then the third pillar of this project of the acute trauma help is not just the therapeutical or psychological treatment that we can refer sex workers into, but also what is happening at the Hydraverse, so to speak. Can we establish or continue already existing accesses to the counseling services at Hydra? Do they have a need of talking to one of the social workers, or do they need more community-based support structures? Can we support people with certain financial burdens, i.e., for example, at Hydra, there's a solidarity fund for covering certain legal costs that sex workers may face, etc., etc. So this project is not just really standing only by itself, which the referrals into the psychological stabilizing short-term treatment is very helpful, but it's also embedded within all the other structures, support structures and counseling office that Hydra has and that we know of. Like, it's not just only about what is happening at Hydra, but what other resources can we suggest to the sex worker in question in order to have a more holistic, if I may use that word, experience for mental health support, which is not just like, oh, go to that particular therapist and only there your problems or acute issues find space, but also to see like, where are social workers or community builders or peers sometimes also in a position where they have to basically take over the labor or work that usually therapists would do, even though they're not being super trained for that, because it's just out of necessity. There's so much lack of access. To move on to the problems that we or I have encountered during that during the project. The project started at the end of 2020, and in the context of COVID and everything, this is the first year that it's up and running. So as much as we have positive feedback, but there are also obviously problems that we have or that I have identified. One essential problem is the lack of funding for translators, even though in Berlin, because it's a big city, it's not in the countryside, and it's very intercultural, international. We have a good pool of therapists that are located closely to us that we can potentially work with. But at the same time, many people and few therapists, or not enough therapists, therapists have a lot of work to do in Berlin. So it's also difficult to find all of the therapists with the individual profiles that are needed to cover all demands of all potential sex workers that might come to us. And even when we can work with translators, sometimes it is still a little bit demotivating for a sex worker who wants to take the opportunity to get the short-term therapeutical support or treatment, but then is aware of that, okay, they cannot speak in their mother tongue, and then it has to be via a translator. It is at some points hinders sometimes the communication flow. But even if this isn't ideal, but there is a lack of sufficient funding for even paying and hiring enough translators to cover all languages and reduce the language barriers. There's also a lack of accessibility to like the perfect fit, how I named it, because especially also in therapy, I guess people also have to click with each other. That's why some of the therapists we work with also offer like a free of charge first meeting to figure out if the sex worker who we referred feels comfortable with that individual person. But it also has a lot to do with people facing multiple dimensions of discrimination, and with whom can people really feel safe or safer to talk about all aspects of their experiences. Particularly one problem also of the COVID pandemic, which has just worsened the already existing problem, is that sometimes we get in contact with sex workers who in their own life lack a this basic level of contextual stability in their life to actually tackle mental health problems, to kind of move away from this survival mode where you're dealing and you're kind of trying to cope and continue, to coming to a place where you feel stable enough to even allow yourself to deal with the mental health problems, traumas, etc., a person might come with. So that's definitely a problem, which means that to a certain degree, there has to be a basic minimum of stability in a person's life for them sometimes to have the privilege of prioritizing or appropriately dealing with the mental health problems and for satisfying their own needs as well that they would need for that. And another problem that I've come across a lot of times when sex workers sent me an email, called me, or got into contact with me because they want to get referred, that there's also a lot of times this hesitance from the last point of am I suffering enough to take the spot that somebody else may need more than me? Which is for sure not behavior or some kind of framing or thought that is exclusive to sex workers. But I was really sometimes even positively touched and surprised by how much awareness for solidarity there is among sex workers who themselves are in grave crisis and always keep on repeating okay, but maybe I'm still okay, I'm still doing all right. If there are people who have it worse than me, just give them the spot. Don't let me take from somebody who needs it more than me. So there's also the problem of how to make people realize that they have a right to ask for the care and the mental health treatment that they otherwise don't get. The conclusions that so far we could draw in the project are mostly very positive. So from the therapist side, there was and is a lot of awareness that they're lacking the sensitization or the awareness of how stigma against sex work works, not just in the society in general, but also within the healthcare sector. So therapists are very happy to be able to educate themselves, to know kind of who to listen to, because in the public sphere, the topic of sex work, because of swerves and other unfortunate groups, is just so highly controversial that a lot of times therapists told me or us that they didn't even know where to start. So therapists are very happy to be able to sensitize themselves, educate and professionalize themselves, and to offer constructive support. Social workers and community builders that I was in contact with are very happy because they have more often than before now the opportunity to really differentiate between what is their work and what falls into already the work of therapists, of people who have to be trained professionals in order to be able to hold the space and also catch acutely traumatized sex workers or people with their emotions in their crisis and how to constructively work with that. So social workers and community workers connected to the work at Hydra are also happy because they told me from the feedback that I got, they have something tangible to offer and they themselves can more clearly differentiate where their work starts and where it ends and where their capacities are just not enough, such a harsh way of framing, but where their capacities cannot be situated or demanded in such an intense way because the setting and the training is just not there. Sex workers as well are at least the ones who got in contact with us for that project so happy. I mean, I've had experiences where people bursted out into tears just because they felt there was such a relief of being offered an access to acutely needed health treatment, really essential stuff, health treatment, that sometimes people start crying when they hear okay, within usually between 1 and 3 weeks, maximum 3 weeks, we can get you an appointment with a therapist. And people start crying because they feel so relieved. They feel seen. They feel like they're being taken seriously. And instead of having these hurdles of months and months of filling out applications and writing stuff and dealing with bureaucracy and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, it almost sometimes feel like a win in the lottery. That was one expression that I heard. Clearly, this is all just a summary. It's not, there are issues as well. Sometimes, for example, sex workers ask for different recommendations because they didn't like the 3 offers or suggestions that they usually make after each talk, after each person that kind of like notifies us that they want to be referred. There's a talk with the person they feel most comfortable talking with, and to what expectations they have or requirements for therapists they have. Then usually I offer, or I tell them about 3 options that they can talk to and contact. And if neither of the 3 therapists that I suggested in the first round is of their liking, they can obviously get more suggestions or offers. So that also happens, that maybe sometimes, finding the perfect fit, so to speak, can be difficult, because it also has a lot of times to do with like interpersonal sympathies and if people can feel safe or safer in a certain setting. But in general, the feedback has been really, really good. And an essential conclusion of this project, which is nothing new and revolutionary, but just it's worthwhile to emphasize it again. If the state, society, whoever wants to support sex workers, the solution is not criminalization or creating more hurdles or more state-run control for sex workers, but the solution lies in creating and granting accesses and protecting the rights of sex workers, instead of treating sex workers like some passive, victimized other that need to be saved, so to speak. No, instead, sex workers need simply to be treated with respect and supported in making the decisions they want to make for, or we want to make for our lives. So I hope I'm not running out of time. This was just a quick overview of the project Acute Help for Trauma. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them now, or otherwise you can also write me an email at akutetraumahilfe@hydra-berlin.de for any questions or information, etc., etc. I'm more than happy to answer questions or even talk about potential cooperations, etc., etc. That was my presentation from my end now. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm curious about the questions that you might have.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nadia. We'll do questions once we've had our final speaker, and I'm now able to introduce her, and that is Sabrina Michel. Sabrina is a woman with trans experience and a migration background, and she's also been part of formerly ICRSE and now ESWA as a board member for the last 4 years. And this has allowed her to broaden her knowledge about legal frameworks, networking, and organizing. And despite having written that in her bio, she's got fantastic experience organizing. She started getting involved with sex work activism with APROSEX in Barcelona. And then in 2018, alongside other sex workers, she was one of the co-founders of OTRAS, the first sex worker-led trade union in the country. And she is going to be sharing her experiences about initiatives in Spain.
Thank you very much, Rosie. Thank you very much, everybody. What was missing in the intro, but it's okay because I'm going to say it anyway, is that I'm currently the new coordinator of ESWA. After 8 years that our colleague Lucas Stevenson of a great work from his part, and that this big growth that ICRSE now ESWA has experienced is a lot thanks to his work and the rest of the team. And I also want to have the occasion and now that I have the occasion to congratulate Jules and for this event. That it's running fantastically, and also the great work on the report and the briefing paper. It has been like an absolutely amazing work, and I want to congratulate you. Thank you very much, Jules, for your great work. And my intervention must more than only the experience in Spain, given that I'm currently representing the network of more 100 organizations, of sex worker-led organizations in 35 countries across Europe and Central Asia. I would like this intervention, and this intervention, I would like to give like a couple of examples of community-led health services that are more are analytic examples of health services, but they started basically as usual as the most health services aimed for sex workers that are on the STI prevention, but that has also evolved because basically we cannot put apart the mental health from the rest of the general health of our body. So it's an integral part of our health. And also, given my background as a migrant, as a trans woman, these examples seem to me important because were created from, or were initiatives from trans groups, trans sex worker groups, also sex workers that are Black people of color or that have migration background. So it's important to underline that because even though we are the most marginalized, or one of the most marginalized collectives, being trans, being migrant, being a person of color, that has also made us realize that there was this lack of services, of access to health that has been traditional to certain kind of individuals, certain kind of bodies, usually like the non-white bodies and gender diverse or gender diverse bodies. But I would like to start with Accepteste. Accepteste, it's our member in Paris. They are the sex worker-led trans migrant organization. And their objective basically has always been to strengthen a culture of health promotion through individualized support and also through the dynamics of trans groups and their partners. As I mentioned before, they started with HIV and AIDS prevention, and STIs and HIV and AIDS prevention, because the funding and the resources have been always more abundant in the HIV prevention, and there has been always that the solely health provision that are usually targeted to sex workers from the institutions. That's with this narrative of trying to keep the public safe from our diseases. I air quote everything here, and there has been always that control and all the resources from the organizations towards what it's the health services to sex workers, and taking that opportunity. Accepteste had started this service of provision where sex workers are received by a team of counselors that are trained and experienced in the promotion of sexual health, with whom they will have also the opportunity to speak freely about their practices, their lifestyle, and they can be able to advise the sex workers and the users of this service to guide them accordingly to their own needs. It's very important that in these services, as it has been mentioned before by the rest of the panelists, that it's important that our space is free of stigma, the stigma, the sex worker stigma, and also that extra stigmatization around our trans identities, that self-transphobia that sometimes in some cases we have due to the to all the discourses, the hate speeches and discourses against around our identities. That also it's that's also it's a prejudice to our mental health after all. So the Acceptance Tech Queer Sexual Health Space has been worked since 2014 with the Bichat Hospital, that it's located around 10 minutes away from their premises, and they also work directly with CEGID, that is a free information screening and diagnosis center in Paris, and the SMIT, the Infectious and Tropical Disease Service. This work alongside the institutions hasn't come free. This has come from this daily work, this daily provision for services that are a huge underserved population is aimed and it's served. Because of the institutions are not seems that usually they're not aware of our existence, or simply they just ignore our needs. So this work that has been doing between Acceptance and also the medical institutions is it's basic for the better working in for a better work for the sex workers that require them, and also it also help us to create a certain network of health professionals that can provide good services to sex workers. Also, talking about mental health. Psychological permanence. They also they realize this psychological permanence, that it's a confidential consultation. It's anonymous and free, and it's a free listening space. It's done by them every week, and of course also the framework is comprehensive. It's sensitive to gender and sexuality issues, and they are also part of a non-pathologizing perspective, of course, given the trans experience. In these sessions, it's a moment for sex workers to exchange alone or accompanied with a psychologist for any specific reason in relation to the transition or to sex work or to any other related issues that they could need. And of course, this, given to the COVID restrictions, this has to be made in advance. But if you are in Paris or you know someone that is in Paris and needs that help, you can always go to Acceptance Tech. They're part of. You can reach them on our website at ESWA or directly to their social media as well. And a huge part of the projects that our colleagues in Paris at Acceptance realize that can be for the outside view can be seen as not important, but of course it's very related to the mental health. And it's the fact that it's in a very ludic way. It's the fact of celebrating, have this monthly day of celebrating the sex workers' birthday of that month, of that concrete month, because there has come the need, given that our experience that we cross the ocean from Latin America. Most of the trans sex workers from Acceptance Tech come from Latin America, and of course also Asia and Africa. That's very far away from our countries, and the depression that you can have for being that it's your birthday and nobody being far away from the people that you celebrate with, and not having that network of friendship to celebrate a special date for yourself that can be your birthday. So this is an exercise that for me personally, and for many groups that know about it, it seems like a very simple idea, and something that can improve your mental health only by knowing that you're going to celebrate your birthday someday with your colleagues, that you are also share living experiences and working experience. So I wanted to highlight this as like a note of like a joyful note, and also to realize that that keeping a mental health, it's not only only about health professionals or that are important, of course, and they're super helpful, and that we really need to have good health professionals that are not biased against sex work, that are not biased against gender identities or gender expressions. But of course, this peer efforts that usually you don't need more than the connections of your own community and maybe a park or a place to celebrate, and without any funding, there exist these exercises of trying to improve our health, our community, our mental health in a daily basis, in small details, big and small details like this. And also the next example I would like to tell you about is TransUnited Europe. They are also a trans-led organization in Amsterdam, but also with branches in other countries. It's rapidly growing, and they also realized from the beginning the need from a clinic for that covered trans specific issues. This trans clinic was supported at the beginning by COC Netherlands and the help of the municipality of Amsterdam. And in 2021, this year, they also started to collaborate with doctors with the health service of Amsterdam, and they also added to their services the services that they are already being offering as trans services like hormone therapy, of course, psychological counseling and mental health provisions. They also added blood testing, STD and HIV blood testing, and also the PrEP therapy access. That, as we know, this usually these efforts tend to be holistic, because you basically, as we told you before, you cannot separate one thing from another, and sometimes the fact of living with HIV, that can also being detrimental being detrimental for the mental health. So of course the approach of TransUnited is the pathologization and also the gender specific care and sexual health care for trans people, that always having their main motivations, and this holistic view that also covers the mental health by providing a very safe space when the users of the trans clinic arrive after being in contact with them. They are received by a peer trans person to get the first interview, the first contact. Of course, in TransUnited they get all the information from that person for getting their file and for a better following of their cases, and it's an accompaniment for usually the most vulnerable among the sex workers. There are also asylum seekers. That it's another population that TransUnited has been focusing on because of course of this this historical underserving for these populations. They also, in this collaboration with a service provider for sex workers, that it's PNG 292 in Amsterdam. They work in collaboration with them, and as well as also the health service from Amsterdam and all the hospitals and HIV clinicians, where they can have checkups and also be redirected for mental health services as well, and if needed too, also legal services. All the questions and all the requirements and all the requirements from sex workers, of course, are anonymous and are always even not mattering the migration status or any other legal barrier that can prevent them to access to any other health service. That it's a common problem for our communities, that lack of access that can be legal or simply because of stigmatization or pathologization that usually prevent us to access this health services. And I don't want to take more of the time. I think that there are a lot of questions and inquiries that from the attendees that I also appreciate very much the fact that they are here. And thank you very much for your attention and for your coming here.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. And as you have already very neatly introduced, we now have some time for questions, either for George or for Nadia or for Sabrina, or even if anyone wants to throw out a topic for discussion and for people to share their thoughts on. Please do pop them in the chat, or there is also a specific sort of Q&A box on the Zoom. So yeah, it's floor is open. And in the meantime, also thank you for all of your comments in the chat as well. And I hope all of the speakers can read these because they're lovely. Yeah, some more thank yous to the panelists. Yeah, I think everybody has the same sort of sentiments. Also, if people don't necessarily want to ask questions right now, but they have a question for a specific person or they think of something later, if speakers feel comfortable doing it, would they like to pop their contact information in the chat so that people can make a note of it and potentially ask a question or two in the future? Other than that, if there are no questions from people, we can wrap up. I would like to thank every single one of our speakers for sharing all of your knowledge and your information. Thank you for all of the incredible work that you do. And thank you to everybody who's attended as well. And I really hope that you have been able to learn some interesting information from this and to potentially pick up some ideas or some knowledge that may be able to help inform your own practice if this is something that you would be able to do. Thank you for all of your time, all of your attention, and I've just spotted a question coming up in the chat. It's a question from Lucinda at ESS Wellness. There is so much to do and time money is short, but approaching accrediting bodies and psychological associations to talk about pathologization, not only of the general sex worker population, but of therapists who also have a sex work background would be really helpful. This way, therapists who are also sex workers or have been sex workers can come out without fear of being thrown off accreditation. I don't know if anybody wants to say anything to that. I think Lucinda's made a great point there.
Can I maybe take that, Rosie? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Hi, Lucinda. Yeah. Absolutely. That's a great shout. Yeah. Could we talk? Could we maybe perhaps have a chat out with us? I'm guessing. I don't know. Are you UK based? Because if you are, then we're maybe the best people for you to talk about, for you to talk to. So happy to have that chat afterwards, if that's okay with you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, George. And with that, I hope everybody has an absolutely wonderful rest of your day, and that you have gone away with some more information to think about. Yeah, I think that's it. I don't really know how else we can close this off.
Thank you, Rosie.
Thank you so much
for joining. Have a nice day,
everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining.